And so now we are to hear our last speaker for this session, who is Professor Naomi Ellemers. She is a distinguished professor at Utrecht University in the Faculty of Social and Social Sciences, and she will be talking about the effect of gender in organizations.
Yeah, so just to give you a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about, it will be slightly different than the prior speakers, because in my lab we're trying to address the full cycle of what's going on in organizations. So we do different projects, different types of studies and different methodologies where we work together with organizations and external stakeholders to capture the problems that they're facing in their daily interactions in the workplace. And then we extract from those issues, we try to extract underlying mechanisms that might be relevant. We examine those in isolation in our lab. We use a different range of different methodologies to do that. And then we also take that evidence back to the organizations to develop and test the impact of different interventions. And we also try to do that in our publication strategy, where we not only try to publish in scientific outlets, because we have experienced that many practitioners don't have access to these outlets, or if they do, they find it very difficult to translate the information that is there into their practical issues. So we also try to publish products, if you wish, handouts, guidelines, practical ways of dealing with issues where we translate the scientific evidence for practitioners, and we also give that back to them in events or in master classes or what have you. So we try to do all of this, and that's also how I'm going to explain to you today what we're working on in our lab. And so I will talk about four different issues that I think are important in this context. So I will talk a little bit about denial of discrimination. I will challenge the idea that there are equal opportunities for men and women in organizations. I will talk a little bit about what Professor Rippon also mentioned, the problems that women in particular face in organizations where they either have to fit in or opt out, and I'm not so sure whether it's a personal choice to opt out. And I will finish by indicating some practical ways of addressing these issues. So let's first talk about denial of discrimination. And we already heard a lot today about categorization, stereotypes, biases, and what have you. And I think what is important in the work that we do is that stereotypes and category-based expectations are not just very coarse representations of what people see in the real world in terms of different behaviors or different characteristics. So these are the descriptive stereotypes, as we refer to them, but there are also these expectations of what men and women are like, also translated to what we call prescriptive stereotypes, so what men and women should be like. And so that acquires already a different meaning, where it's not just, oh, I see that men and women are different, but also I think that men and women should be different. And here we have a study where we show that women and men agree that men are not only more competent, but also that men should be more competent than women. And so it's this motivated reasoning that we're very interested in. These are the ideas of what organizations should be like, what people should be like, which impact the behavior of individuals and impact the behavior of people in organizations. And so if you look at all the evidence, and here are just a few examples, and I think they very closely match to the evidence that was shown by the first speaker in this session, is that there's loads of evidence showing that even when there's objectively identical performance, and you can do experiments, or you can do with large data sets, you can control for all kinds of individual differences, and it's very obvious that there is a lot of gender stereotyping going on, for instance, in evaluating academic performance of men and women. And so, in a way, when you look at all this evidence, it's pretty obvious that if there's an imbalance between positions or opportunities of men and women in organizations or in science in particular, that we should look at stereotypical expectations as much as we should look at anything else. But what's interesting, and I think for me this is one of the most important messages I would like to convey today, is that for us researchers doing all these studies and collecting all this evidence and communicating about this evidence, we think, well, now it's obvious, right? So we've shown you that there is bias and there are stereotypes and people are unable to evaluate others objectively. So now you know it. So now, you know, go and do something with that. But it's, of course, it's not so easy to say, okay, here's the evidence, so now we will change the way we run our organization. So what we typically get when publishing stuff like this is that we get a lot of responses. And actually we get more responses on studies like this than any other research that we do. And I've just brought you two examples. So one on the left-hand side are the responses that we received in a study that we did in our lab. But on the right-hand side, a very similar pattern documented by other researchers. This was Corinne Moss-Verkusen and her colleagues, a very famous John versus Jennifer study, where they had the same CV, and it was either John applying for the job or Jennifer applying for the job, and then they found out, well, for anybody who's doing more longer time research in this area, it wasn't a new finding, but they documented that people were more likely to offer the job to John, even though the credentials were identical, and he would earn higher wages, and he would be helped more to adjust to his job, etc., etc. And so they received a lot of feedback from readers on their study, and it was very similar to the feedback that we received for our study, also demonstrating gender bias in academia. And so what we see here is that people don't really accept the evidence, but people say, no, but your science must be wrong, and we received very lengthy elaborations on the statistics were wrong, and different syntax should be used, and we didn't have the right corrections and whatever. And we see there's a big difference between who is giving this type of critique. So the men apparently reading this evidence have much more difficulty accepting the evidence and spent many more words explaining to us that our research was wrong. And the same happened to Corinne and her colleagues, where most of the men said, no, but there is no bias against women, there's bias against men. You are examining the wrong problem, and actually your research is not very good. And so as researchers, I think we should not be naive, and we shouldn't just, you know, put our evidence out there and then assume that people will draw their conclusions and adjust their behavior. There's also very strong motivation to believe that the system that we have, or the organizations that we have, are just, are fair, give equal opportunities to everybody. And if we show evidence countering that, then people are very strongly resisting that evidence. And that's a more general phenomenon. We've done a lot of research on that, using many different types of research methodologies and many different types of samples, where we show that people feel particularly threatened in their identities and in their self-views when they're being criticized for their moral behavior. And so we do experiments where we say, oh, what happens if you're being criticized for lack of competence, or what if you're being criticized for behaving unfairly towards someone else. And we see time and again that people are much more strongly affected and feel offended by the fact that they might not be fair and might not be able to treat everybody fairly. And so that's very threatening to people's self-views. And it's not even when they are being criticized for their individual behavior, but also when we criticize their fellow teammates or other people in their organization. So people are very motivated generally to believe that everybody is behaving morally and everybody's behaving fairly, or at least everybody who's connected to themselves in one way or the other. And when people are criticized for that, that's very offensive, and they suffer in the cognitive domain, in the affective domain, and in the social domain. And we can document that with many studies. And we think this is very relevant to how such research on gender discrimination and gender bias is being received, because if you say that people are biased, then you're challenging their moral self-views, or the morals, their view that their organization is a fair place where everybody's treated fairly. And we think that is a part of the problem. And so here's one example of the type of study that we do. where we take cardiovascular indicators, so heart rate and blood pressure changes compared to baseline, where we make a distinction between the experience of negative threat versus positive challenge. And so the negative threat state is where people think the situation is very overwhelming and they cannot really cope with it, and their body responds like that. So the heart rate goes up, but the blood vessels constrict, so it's not a very adaptive response of the body. And we see in the positive challenge situation that the body responds adequately because it is a challenging situation, but your body is able to cope with that, so your heart rate goes up, but your blood vessels also dilate, so oxygen is flowing through your body and through your brain, and you're ready to face a difficult situation. And so what we see here is that if we frame equal treatment of men and women, or equal treatment or lack of discrimination in organization as an obligation that people need to meet, then that is a very threatening situation for people. And also when we ask them to generate ideas on how to do that, then they don't really come up with anything. So they're literally, they're blocking also their thinking on that. And when we say, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could achieve this, and wouldn't it be nice, ideal for the future, whatever, we see it's much more a positive challenge, and also people generate more ideas on how to do that. And so here's just one piece of evidence, but just to show you how we examine these issues and how we see that there are differences in how and when people feel threatened by the idea that they will not be treating others fairly. And so one of the things that we think is related to that is that people try to think that everybody is being treated fairly, and so, for instance, sexism doesn't exist anymore, so these days men and women are treated equally. And we also see that if we compare what we call old-fashioned sexism, so these are ideas about, oh, men are naturally better, or women are less smart, or whatever, less good at logical thinking, then people would say, oh, but that's, I don't agree with that, and I would recognize that is sexist. But if we give people statements which we refer to as modern sexism, saying, well, but women and men have equal opportunities and they're treated the same and discrimination is no longer a problem, people say, yeah, that's true, I agree with that. I like to believe in a just world, and I don't recognize that as being a form of sexism. So why do we say it is a form of sexism? It's because we think this is also denying discrimination, and it's giving a dual message to people. Because if you insist that everybody nowadays has equal opportunities and has equal chances to succeed, and at the same time you observe every day that women are less successful than men, well, then if it's not discrimination because everybody has equal opportunities, it must be something about these women. So apparently they are less competent, or they're less ambitious, or they make different choices, and yeah, well, that's their own responsibility because we treat everybody equally. And so we say that this denial of discrimination, so on the one hand insisting that everybody has equal opportunities while it's obvious that people don't have equal outcomes, and so denying that there might be something going on there but doesn't treat them equally, that is what we also call a form of sexism. And so the important question then is, do people really have equal opportunities nowadays? Because that would be the answer that we seek. And so here's the study that attracted all these comments from people who were reading it and didn't accept the evidence that we did for the Dutch National Science Foundation a few years ago. So we had a large number of applications and evaluations of these applications, and we examined them. And what we saw that during the evaluation procedure, at every step of the way, less women than men would proceed to the next stage. And then here the candidates were evaluated on 3 different criteria. So one was the individual of the researcher, individual characteristics of the researcher, one would be the quality of the proposal, and one would be the contribution to knowledge for society. And what we see here is that actually the content of the research proposal was evaluated equally positively for women and for men. The contribution of the science to society was also evaluated equally, but the only difference that we found was the evaluation of the individual individual researcher. And the lower scores here mean more favorable, so higher prioritizations. So the men were evaluated more favorably than the women, even though the reviewers and the committee members didn't see any difference in the studies they proposed. So we thought this was very interesting, and then we looked a little bit deeper, and by the way, we were criticized a lot for this study, but other colleagues in other countries and other systems found very similar effects, so we think this is a valid phenomenon. And so when we looked better into also what are the instructions provided to reviewers, what are the instructions provided to applicants or to committee members, we saw a lot of masculine language. So all the characteristics that were being named for you have to look for this, or you have to look for that, or you have to evaluate how much ambition or how much drive or how much, and so we coded these linguistic terms, and we found much more overlap between the criteria that were being used and masculine stereotype words. So we think that implicitly everybody was prompted to think, well, this is the image of success. It looks more like a man than like a woman. So that might explain, at least in part, why the male applicants were evaluated more favorably, even though their ideas were not considered more interesting. And so we are very interested in further exploring these issues. And so what we did in another study, we interviewed many men and women in an organization, an academic organization, and we said, okay, so in this university, you see that the women are less successful in their careers than the men are. So can you explain to me what you think is the main reason why this is the case? And so most people, men and women, say, well, it must have to do something with work-life issue. Women have babies, and then they want to work part-time, and they are not so ambitious anymore. And so it's something about that. Or some women, yeah, they make different choices. I don't understand it, but this is what they do. And they say, yeah, well, it's nothing to do with gender. It's very competitive. Everybody finds it very difficult to make a career. It's nothing different for men and women. And the least mentioned reason was, well, perhaps women receive less support from the organization, but that was the least important one. And then we continued the study, and we did a survey in the same organization. We surveyed large numbers of male and female researchers there, and we said, well, so what about your own personal situation? So how ambitious are you? Well, we found no differences. Or how much support do you get from the organization? Oh, women said they receive a little bit less support than men did. And do you think men and women are treated equally in this organization? Well, actually, the men thought it was pretty good, but the women said no, we're not receiving equal treatment. So here what we see is a disjoint between people's personal experiences, where men and women say we're equally ambitious, but the women report receiving less support and less equal treatment from the organization. Men see this to a less extent. But when people are being asked to reflect on, well, how do you think about the gender differences in your organization, then they mainly attribute this to work-life issues, to personal choices of women, and they don't really recognize that lack of, so they acknowledge that there is lack of organizational support, but they don't connect this to the career disparities. So they don't see this as a reason for women to be less successful. And if you don't see this as a reason, then yeah, you're not going to fix it, of course. And so there are many different situations where we can find this. So this is a study done by my colleague Belle Derks, who investigated in the Netherlands also a large number of academics, and she investigated what the conditions are under which these people have to perform. And it shouldn't surprise you, because similar studies have been done in other countries, but this one was quite recent. And what we see here is that women are more likely than men to be working on temporary contracts, on part-time contracts, to be hired mainly for teaching jobs, and they have typically less time for research, less of a budget for research or for travel, less support from the organization. And so women have to perform under more difficult conditions. And actually she repeated the study during the COVID pandemic, and it shouldn't be surprised that also the female academics, and especially those with small children, suffered much more from the pandemic and from working from home and having to homeschool the children at the same time and taking care of everybody. And so the setback was even larger. And then we always get, oh yes, but this is because women don't know how to negotiate. Women don't ask, women are not assertive, and they should just, you know, learn to negotiate like a man and just ask for a raise and then everything will be fine. So there are studies showing that if you teach women to negotiate in the same way as men do, then they can do this, but they don't get the same results, right? So they're being overly aggressive and self-inflating, and what do they think of themselves, and it's not that they're worth so much. And also in this study, Bella asked these women, well, did you try to argue for better conditions? And said, yeah, I did actually. And they were more likely to say, well, I complained about my contract, I complained about my part-time assignment, I complained about my teaching duties, but I didn't get what I wanted, and so I'm not very satisfied with the outcome. So I think this is very clear evidence showing that women and men are supposedly having equal opportunities, but they have to perform under very different conditions. And so the question is, well, how does this impact on people? How does this work? And I think it's a very nice combination with your talk, looking a little bit more at the organizational mechanisms going on there. And so one thing that we examined, again, I was involved in this as well, is what about the women in academia in different generations. And we've been doing this work for many years now, in many different studies, in many different contexts. And what we find is always it's the same thing, that when you look at early career individuals and you ask people to describe their self-views and their own personality traits, we find that women see themselves as less masculine than men do. But if you look at the senior career level, so people are successful in the organization, we see no difference. So the men and the women all see themselves as very masculine. And we take this as evidence that the organization requires people to display masculine behavior in order to be successful, and teaches women to behave like that in order to be successful. And if they are not up to that, or if they don't feel comfortable with that, then they opt out. Well, is that a personal choice? And so we think what is going on right here is that there's a lot of emphasis in many organizations on diversity, getting in many different people, and then we're all going to be more creative and more successful and earn more money and I don't know what. But what happens in reality is either of these two things happen, that either people think, well, okay, so I have to adjust, so I have to act just like everybody else, so this is the way to be successful, and then they do, but yeah, they just act like everybody else, so there's no diversity. Or they say, oh, I feel so unhappy here, I really don't belong, I'm going to work somewhere else. And so the net result is that you can get in as many different people as you wish as the front end, but if you don't give them the opportunity to perform in different ways, and if you don't appreciate their differences, they're all going to end up in the same way. Eenheidsworst, we say in Dutch. Don't know how that's being translated. And so what we do if we examine this, and this is a result of a study that we did, is if you look at what matters for work-relevant outcomes, it is not what we call surface-level dissimilarity, whether people look like they are different or like they're men or women or old or young or have brown skin or white skin or whatever skin they have. It is mostly whether they feel that they are different or not, and whether the climate in the organization allows for that, allows for people to be different and still be included. And then that is what predicts all the relevant work-related outcomes. So it's not so much getting in many different people, but it's about making them feel included and valued, even if they are different or feel different. And so there are important practical implications from that. I'm coming to the end. So we have developed a monitor for organizations, and many organizations have participated in this monitor so far, in which we systematically evaluate the diversity policy in the organization. And so many university organizations also have participated in this, and we evaluate the policy, but we also evaluate, or we ask the people working in that organization how they feel about the policy, whether they notice that they're being treated differently or whatever. And so what we see here is that many of the policies focus only on the first part of the problem. So they are very much focused on getting in all these people, and then, yeah, we have all these people on board, so we're doing well. But then what you do to make them feel included, or what you do to make them feel that they can advance in the organization, or when they leave, to follow up and to check, well, did you leave for the right reasons, or did you leave for the wrong reasons, and perhaps we need to adjust something. There's much, much less attention for that. And so we give also back to the organizations this type of evidence showing, look, there's much more that you can do to avoid this revolving door problem, where you have a lot of effort in recruiting many different people, but they leave very quickly, and you're not really benefiting from that as an organization. And so one of the things we do is say, well, and giving everybody an obligatory anti-bias program, it's not necessarily going to help. And so we prepare these colorful handouts where we explain that anti-bias training, it's not a solution for every problem, and there are good ones and there are bad ones, and some of them actually have this false sense of security, so, oh, we all did the program, so now we can't be biased anymore. And so we also try to educate the organizations for the relevant evidence that is out there. And so we try to be very practical. We try to empower people on the work floor, and we try to work with the policy makers and the decision makers to say, okay, what can you do? And it's not just being aware of the bias that it's going to solve everything. And so we do a lot also of projects. So here's a project in the university Senate Hall, where there were only portraits of dead men hanging on the wall. So as an art project, we printed screens of female professors, and we hung the screens before the portraits, and so that attracted a lot of publicity, and people were also commenting saying, oh, these images of success are very powerful and they're very important. And so it opened the eyes also of many universities in my country now have started putting up portraits of women as well, and so they suddenly, oh, and on the website, oh yeah, we should also have pictures. And so this awareness that all these implicit messages are important, it is increasing, so that's nice, I think. So the perspective I want to give you is that people want to do the right thing, people want to be fair, people want to work in moral organizations, and that's a very good motivation, but it can also work against you, because it can prevent you from accepting the evidence that you might still have problems these days, and so you might not yet be fair, or you might treat people unfairly. And so we need do a lot of work, not just to put out the evidence, but also to work with the organizations and to convince them, and also to teach them and to help them take easy steps that they can take and that they feel are feasible to change the situation. So just demonstrating bias is not enough. You really have to look into the organization to see how you can offer equal support to everybody, how you can help them celebrate the differences, and how we can help, as researchers, we can help the organizations who are willing to improve to do that, and not just throw out our research and say, well, now it's your problem. Thank you.